are not a lot of weapons in pop culture that you can instantly recognize, unless they're very deeply tied to a hero's identity, like Thor and his hammer Mjolnir, or Captain America and his shield. The power sword wielded by He-Man is just as iconic. More than just a blade, it's the key to his transformation, the symbol of his destiny, and the conduit of the mysterious force that makes him the most powerful man in the universe. Without it, Prince Adam is simply a royal heir, but with it, he becomes a living legend. The sword's not just important, it's essential and almost mythic in its presence across the Masters of the Universe franchise. But where did this legendary weapon truly come from? Was it forged by the wise hands of the Sorceress of Castle Grayskull? Gifted by ancient beings? Or shaped by forces far older than Eternia itself? Over the decades, different versions of the story have hinted at deeper origins, but the real story behind the sword's creation is far more mysterious, and in some versions of the lore, its origin is completely different from what most people remember. So, who really created the power sword? And why does its history keep changing? Without wasting another moment, let's get right to it. Early mini-comics, 1981, and the Filmation 1983 cartoon. So, in the very first mini-comic, He-Man and the Power Sword, the one from the 80s that originally came packaged with the figure, there the sword was not introduced as something newly forged or explained in detail. Rather, it already exists but is split into two halves as an ancient and powerful artifact. Now, Skeletor is determined to bring those halves back together, believing that doing so will unlock its true, overwhelming power. What is especially interesting is how the comic hints at the sword's origins without ever fully spelling them out. When Skeletor describes what will happen if the halves are reunited, he mentions that the magic fires created by ancient scientists and sorcerers will blaze again. This fascinating detail suggests that the Power Sword and the forces tied to Castle Grayskull were born from an amalgamation of advanced knowledge and mystical energy. Basically, as Beastman and Skeletor invaded Castle Grayskull with the unconscious body of the sorceress, Skeletor openly defied the spirit of the castle and vowed to learn all of its secrets. He already had half of the Power Sword, and now he aimed to possess the other half, which was hidden within Castle Grayskull's walls, because joining both halves would allow him to have full power over any of the deadly traps within the castle. But that is as far as the explanation goes, because these ancient scientists and sorcerers that he mentioned are never named, never shown, and never fully explored. Instead of giving us a clear creator, the story simply leans into mystery, making the sword feel older, grander, and far more mythic than any single origin ever could. All we find out is that Skeletor once lived in another dimension that was populated with many others of his kind, but when the Great Wars ended up opening a hole in the dimensional wall, he was thrown into Eternia's world. With the complete Power Sword, Skeletor pretty much aimed to open the hole into his dimension and bring his people into this dimension so they could conquer it all together. Of course, Skeletor combined the swords and wielded their united might, but that happened only briefly, because with the help of He-Man, the sorceress managed to resplit the swords. Following this, one half ended up at Eternia's highest point, aka Stratos Mountain, and the other half in the hardest rock, where, coincidentally, He-Man built his home. If the swords were ever recombined, they would act as a key and grant one entrance to Castle Grayskull. And what awaits inside Castle Grayskull's legendary walls? The throne to Castle Grayskull and access to the secrets of the universe, which means ultimate power. Lastly, you should know that in the series of the mini-comic included with each of the Masters of the Universe figure, He-Man rarely wielded the Power Sword, as he spent most of his time keeping each half away from Skeletor with his trusty axe and shield. Compared to that, in the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe Filmation cartoon, the Power Sword is not treated as something with a detailed origin story, but is simply made to exist as an essential part of the world. Here, the Sorceress of Castle Grayskull entrusts it to Prince Adam as the key to accessing the power of Grayskull, making it less about where it came from and more about what it allows him to become. The idea is straightforward and iconic because the Power Sword is what enables Adam's transformation into He-Man. By raising it and declaring, "By the power of Grayskull, I have the power!" he channels that ancient energy and becomes Eternia's greatest champion. Not just that, Battle Cat is also the result of a transformation caused by the Power Sword, as his normal state is the cowardly Cringer. Having said that, in the 1983 cartoon, Adam's mission was to defend the secrets of Castle Grayskull, as it's a repository for ultimate universal power. He mainly fights Skeletor and his evil minions using the Power Sword, which channels the power of Castle Grayskull, transforming Adam into an unbelievable powerhouse and his whining talking tiger into Battle Cat, thus making him indestructible and even capable of heaving mountains into the sun. In this cartoon, the Power Sword is capable of deflecting literally anything, cutting through anything, and absorbing and redirecting energy. It is indeed a veritable conduit for Grayskull's incalculable power and the ultimate foil for Skeletor's endless and dependably inept plots. What's interesting, though, is what the show does not explain. At no point does the series or its official episode descriptions ever reveal who actually created the sword. There's no master blacksmith, no ancient sorcerer or scientist, and no definitive origin. Instead, the weapon exists kind of as a sacred constant, which allows its mystery to remain intact, adding to the implication that its power is timeless and beyond ordinary understanding. The Power Sword was wielded by King Grayskull in the 2002 animated series. So far, we're all aware that regardless of the iteration, He-Man's Power Sword is usually a source of immense strength, the key that unlocks it, and the symbol through which it is ultimately channeled. When held aloft, it becomes more than steel and magic as it transforms into the conduit that bridges Prince Adam into something far greater than himself. And this power is literally the fundamental force that powers the universe, and anyone imbued with said power will become the most powerful being in the universe. Now, the 2002 animated series fully ignores the 1989 misfire we see in the New Adventures of He-Man, and instead leans on the Filmation series. Here, the Power Sword and Castle Grayskull are given slightly altered origins. In fact, Castle Grayskull was actually the home of King Grayskull, who turns out to be Prince Adam's powerful ancestor and even looks a lot like He-Man, but is considerably larger with locks of Viking-inspired hair. In this story, King Grayskull wielded the legendary Power Sword to defend Eternia against the dreaded Snake Men, the horrible Horde, and the Horde's more horrible leader, Hordak. During his final battle with Hordak, King Grayskull and his forces were surrounded by a massive portal summoned by Hordak's wizards, leading to the dark dimension Despondos. Grayskull, summoning all his ancient might through the Power Sword, redirected the portal around and below Castle Grayskull, drawing Hordak and his forces through the doorway to Despondo. Having used all his might and suffering a mortal blow, King Grayskull perished, while eternally trapping Eternia's enemies. However, when Grayskull died, he transferred his incredible powers into the sword, and his wife Vina, becoming the first sorceress, sealed the castle with assistance from the Council of Elders. It became their ultimate mission to protect the Power Sword and guard the legacy of Castle Grayskull. In this series, when we see Adam summoning the power of Grayskull, he's actually summoning the energies of King Grayskull himself. To elaborate more on the same detail, in the 35th episode of the series, titled The Power of Grayskull, we witness Prince Adam waking up from a dream involving Hordak, Snake Men, and a warrior very similar in appearance to He-Man. So, he goes to Castle Grayskull to learn more about this strange dream from the sorceress. That is when the sorceress told Adam that the warrior in his dream was King Grayskull, the former ruler of Eternia and lord of Castle Grayskull. Apparently, Grayskull had lost his sword in battle against the Snake Men and sought the power to defeat Hordak, who planned to conquer Eternia at any cost. That's when his wife Vina directed King Grayskull to go to the Oracle for advice, and once he found the strange creature, the Oracle of Zalesia sent him on a quest that tested and proved his courage, wisdom, kindness, and strength. Once Grayskull finally reached the top of Mount Imperium, he realized that the Oracle had already arrived. Once he overcame his shock, the Oracle presented him with his lost sword and told him that Grayskull's true power was within him and always had been. The Oracle even went on to add that Grayskull would not survive the coming fight with Hordak. But Grayskull chose to face his fate without fear and returned to defend Eternia. When Hordak and his forces advanced upon Castle Grayskull, King Grayskull's giant cat trounced the soldiers, while the king easily defeated Hordak's generals. Finally, the two enemies faced each other, but Hordak knocked him back by unleashing his full power. He then commanded his wizards to open a portal to Despondos so that he could send King Grayskull there. However, Grayskull drew upon the power within, commanding that he had the power, protecting Castle Grayskull from entering Despondos. Using the Sword of Power, Grayskull then reversed the spell, and the portal ended up sucking in all of Hordak's forces. This led Hordak's physical being to be destroyed, as he became a spectral form and flew straight through King Grayskull on the way to Despondos before threatening to return. Even if King Grayskull had beaten Hordak, it came at a price, as Hordak had struck a fatal blow. So, King Grayskull left his power to fill his follower, who became the Council of Elders. He then left his sword to Vina so that one day, when it was needed, a great warrior could wield it in battle against evil. That's how the sorceress swore to guard it until the day she must give up her position to another. At the end, King Grayskull died in the company of those who loved him, with his spirit passing into the Power Sword. Forged by King Devon Grayskull in Masters of the Universe Revelation 2021. Netflix's Masters of the Universe Revelation also chose to rely on He-Man's origin story as seen in Filmation and the minicomics origin. In fact, this modern-day continuation is a much more direct continuation of the universally fan-approved roots, which also gives us information on how the Power Sword was actually forged. So, 500 years before the time of He-Man, King Devon Grayskull and his two young sons were attacked by the Snake Men together with their newfound ally, Orlax of Primaria. That's when Grayskull had to forge himself a new weapon with the help of Trollin Magesmiths by using a special kind of dark ore that he obtained from Scareglow in the realm of Subternia. By merging the newly created sword with his own Preternian weapon, he created the invincible Sword of Power that would be used by him and many champions of Eternia in the centuries to come. The first of these was Grayskull's son, Ro, who would later be known as Hero, and the most recent was He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe. Now, in present day, Skeletor, who had been trying to learn the secret of Castle Grayskull for years, finally figured out that the castle was merely a shell and not the real prize, as the building's sole purpose was to protect the Orb of Power. In fact, the castle was only a ruse, an illusion, because what really matters lies inside it, beneath the Hall of Wisdom, which is the repository of all the knowledge that exists in the universe, along with the Orb of Power that holds the concentrated powers of the Council of Elders. So, the Lord of Destruction used his shaping staff to disguise himself and several of his allies in order to gain access to the very heart of Grayskull, because he needed help to open the Hall of Wisdom. Skeletor tricked He-Man into stabbing him with his mighty sword in such a way that the sword would also penetrate the Orb of Power and open it, just as if it were a key. Skeletor then smashed the orb with his own Havoc Staff, thus ultimately cracking it and releasing the incalculable magic power that created Eternia and the very universe. Only the sorceress knew that this meant the end of all existence, but she was somehow able to freeze time for a short period so that she could telepathically confer with He-Man and Teela. Following this, as the best course of action, He-Man tried to absorb the magical energy of the orb by using his Sword of Power as a conduit in order to redirect this explosion of existence-shattering energy, which caused it to split in two. When this happened, his loyal steed Battlecat transformed back into Cringer, and He-Man reverted back to Prince Adam. Naturally, Skeletor attempted to grab the two halves of the sword for himself, but both he and Adam were obliterated in the explosion caused by the magical impact. In fact, the only thing that remained was the top of Skeletor's Havoc Staff. Each half went on to materialize where they had come from. The light side of the sword returned to its place of origin in Preternia, which is a Valhalla-style afterlife enjoyed by Eternia's greatest champion. The other half ended up in Subternia, which is Eternia's version of hell that is lorded over by its master, Scareglow. Now, without the sword, all magic slowly began to wane from Eternia and the planet itself was dying out, meaning that with it, the rest of the universe would go on to die, as the Sword of Power acted as a mystical anchor that bound magic to Eternia. So, with magic practically exploding and the literal anchor splitting in two, things were certainly dire for our heroes in Eternia. Only by calling on the power of Grayskull could Eternia possibly be saved, and so Teela reluctantly accepted the challenge to seek out the two halves of the Sword of Power from its places of origin in Subternia and Preternia, so she could forge them with the last remaining ember of magic. Having said that, if you've watched this series on Netflix, I'm sure you could already guess the nature of the remaining heroes' quests. The Power Sword in live action and animated movie. So, in the 1987 live action film Masters of the Universe, the Power Sword was renamed the Sword of Grayskull. In the cartoon, we see He-Man engage in actual sword fights very rarely, but the film producers knew that the character was closely associated with the sword, which meant that it should feature prominently in the movie's finale. But in the New Adventures of He-Man, released in 1989, the sword is redesigned to look more futuristic and can emit energy blasts, though no new in-universe origin for who forged it has been described, meaning that it's treated as the same mystic power sword that is simply moved into a sci-fi setting. Apparently, when the original toy line was cancelled in 1987 after drastically declining sales, Mattel attempted to relaunch the character just 2 years later, but only after redesigning it. He-Man was slimmed down to a more realistic musculature and transported to the distant future for science fiction adventures on an alien planet named Primus. And like I previously mentioned, along with the revamped character, the Power Sword was also designed into a more futuristic looking form, with a green laser blade that could fire bolts of glowing energy. Then again, in 1990, Jetlag Productions produced a new cartoon, The New Adventures of He-Man, in order to promote the new toy line. In this series, Prince Adam's phrase to transform into He-Man is changed from "by the power of Grayskull" to "by the power of Eternia." Lastly, He-Man's sword was a more important element in this version as it gained the ability to fire energy blasts and pulses of magic.
I am She-Ra!
Sword of Protection, the weapon wielded by Adora. So the Sword of Protection is wielded by Adora, who is Prince Adam's twin sister, and is used in her transformation into the heroic She-Ra and spirits into Swift Wind. Instead of saying the war cry "by the power of Grayskull," Adora's transformation is triggered by calling "for the honor of Grayskull." Her weapon is identical in overall design to the Sword of Power, with only one exception of the Sword of Protection having a jewel embedded in the hilt. The jewel is the key to the powers of the Sword of Protection, which leads to Adora's transformation, because if it's damaged, she loses her ability to transform into She-Ra, as seen in the episode The Stone and the Sword, from Filmation's He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. The stone, which was created by the goddess of Grayskull, also allows Adora to channel all the powers of Grayskull if needed. Not just that, She-Ra's sword is even discovered to be a direct clone of He-Man's, as the goddess felt that Adora's destiny would require her to also tap into the powers of Grayskull with her own sword. In addition to being a powerful weapon that is capable of cutting through most substances or deflecting attacks, the Sword of Protection also has the ability to change its shape, which is not something that the Sword of Power is capable of doing. She-Ra can easily change the sword into a variety of weapons or tools through spoken command that can vary from a shield or lasso to a helmet or flaming blade. She-Ra can also use her sword to draw upon the mystical power of the planet itself, thus increasing her strength beyond her usual level. Now, according to the 2015 DC Comics series He-Man: The Eternity War, the Sword of Protection was forged in case the Sword of Power fell into the wrong hands or the wielder of it became corrupted. However, in Netflix's She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, the Sword of Protection is introduced as an amalgam of technology and magic. Created by the first ones, there have been previous wielders of the sword, all of whom have been able to transform into She-Ra, thus suggesting it is more of a title passed on through generations rather than Adora being She-Ra herself. The sword is also capable of interacting with other pieces of First One's tech, projecting bolts of energy and transforming any animal in a similar manner to Swiftwind's transformation. There's another power sword you might not know about. So, in the Dark Horse miniseries He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, the Sword of Flaws, a new weapon called the Sword of Flaws is introduced as an ancient Praetorian relic and is said to be a literal mirror to He-Man's own power sword. The first issue wastes no time in making it clear that a violet-tinted blade had suddenly emerged from Eternia's past and bears a striking resemblance to He-Man's own silver power sword. The comic immediately names this new weapon as the Sword of Flaws and sets up its mysterious origin as the central mystery. Initially, it's called an ancient and evil artifact, as it had been unearthed from the depths of Eternia. But it's essentially a buried Praetorian power that must be claimed by either the Masters or Skeletor's force. The third issue further teases that the heroes must keep the ancient purple sword out of Skeletor's hands, even as Sorceress and Orko time travel to uncover its origins in Lost Praetornia. As the comic unfolds, we find out that the Sword of Flaws was forged in prehistoric Eternia, aka Preternia, by a sorcerer named Gray. It was essentially a failsafe against the power of Castle Grayskull, and the protectors of the castle themselves witnessed this forging in a magical time travel sequence. Though the comics kept this backstory somewhat mysterious, as the sorceress and Orko merely discovered the truth behind the violet blade, The implication is that it was created to counter or contain Grayskull's might. However, in modern times, violent earthquakes split open the Cairn of Pantheons or Heaven Piercer on Eternia, thus revealing this buried sword. It was Tila who led the royal expedition to retrieve it, while Skeletor sent Evil Lyn, Triclops, and other villains to seize the relic for themselves. Now you have to understand that the Sword of Flaws is explicitly the opposite of He-Man's empowering weapon, as it does not grant strength to the wielder, but rather takes powers from others. As Triclops observes, the blade possesses magical properties that can siphon power from those it wounds. In other words, it's more of a vampiric sword as it drains life force and energy. We can see this happen when Skeletor uses the blade to stab Battlecat during the climax of the saga, and leeches the mighty fighting tiger's power for himself, thus transforming Skeletor into a much more powerful opponent by giving him a frightening edge. In fact, the sword strike almost kills He-Man's loyal mount while supercharging Skeletor, making it an extremely dangerous weapon that literally feasts on heroes. Once the sword is found in the miniseries, we witness it become the focus of desperate combat. In the third issue, when Skeletor ultimately grabs the Sword of Flaws, he uses it against the Master. After thrusting the purple blade into Battlecat and draining her vitality, He-Man is also thrown into shock. In fact, we see how Adam is overcome with a boiling rage after seeing his steed fall, but Man-at-Arms reminds him to hold back his fury. Instead of continuing the fight, He-Man retreats back to seek Sorceress's help to save Battlecat, which goes on to show just how badly the heroes are affected when one of their greatest allies is laid low, and He-Man himself is shaken by the sword's brutality. During the final part of the miniseries, when the Sword of Flaws is still in Skeletor's evil hands, Orko and the Sorceress finally unravel its history by witnessing its creation in Preternia. However, in the present-day battle, Skeletor prevails. Sadly, the issue concludes with Skeletor and his minions escaping with the Sword of Flaws as He-Man and his allies retreat. In other words, the villains carry off the Violet Blade, and the heroes are forced to withdraw, thus setting up more future conflict. Ultimately, the Sword of Flaws serves as the climax of the arc, as it literally turns the tide of battle against the Master. This storyline casts the Sword of Flaws as more than a mere weapon because it embodies the cosmic theme of power and corruption. If you think about it, this miniseries has been a story about power and responsibility of those who wield it. And in that way, the Sword of Flaws forces the heroes to confront the dark side of that equation. Not just that, this story also gives us a canonical origin for Skeletor's purple sword, which has been a long-standing staple of the Masters of the Universe lore. Basically, the comic canonizes the Sword of Flaws as Skeletor's own legendary blade, thus explaining where his iconic purple sword originally came from. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. What do you think about the Power Sword in comparison to the Sword of Protection or the Sword of Flaws? Let us know your thoughts and theories in the comments below.